thank you, Declan. Long-awaited podcast. I feel like I keep saying this, but this is one we've looked forward to.
Well, we've been in touch with this guest, Howard Wolinsky, for ages, and I feel like I know him, but we've only spoken to him for the first time today. Yeah. And we wanted to get him on the podcast to bring his unique perspective as a patient.
That's right. And there's a backstory to this, Declan, isn't there? Because what is that famous saying that you always say of Pat Walsh's?
This is true, and this is why you need to stay tuned into this podcast. Dr. Patrick Walsh at Johns Hopkins, great hero to many of us who do a lot of radical prostatectomies, has a phrase that he uses over and over. He put it in his book. I remember him doing it at a big plenary in the EAU a few years ago, and then he wrote an article in European Urology. And what he says is, if you want to make an important discovery, listen to your patients. And it's that simple bit of advice that cuts through really well. Bit of a mantra. Reminding us, because we sometimes need reminding, how important it is to listen to our patients. Not just because you want to see how are they going and how are they feeling, but because you can get incredible insights from listening to your patients. So that's what we're going to do today. That is what we're going to do today. So let's go to, I think Chicago is where Howard is. Howard Wolinsky, who is joining us to have a chat today about his perspective as a patient and about 3 hot topics of interest to both Howard and us. Howard, you're very welcome to GUcast.
Welcome to GUcast.
Well, would this be like Good Morning Melbourne?
It is. Good morning,
yes,
Melbourne.
Yeah.
You brought up listening, and I was a medical journalist here in Chicago. I was the medical editor of the Chicago Sun-Times for about 25 years. And I wrote about prostate now and again, and I was very good friends with Dr. Gerald Chodak at the University of Chicago, who taught me a lot of the ins and outs of prostate. But of course, I never thought it was going to be me. I never thought about it. Yeah. I wasn't like the medical student who was catching everything. I never thought about the prostate.
Well, tell us a bit about that, because, in the 3 topics we're going to talk about today, active surveillance, trust versus transperineal biopsy, and digital rectal examination, this is all relevant to your own personal story. So take us back.
A lot of it is. It started actually 14 years ago this month. My PSA went up, and I had a very fraidy cat internist who immediately sent me off to a community urologist. And this guy was so immediate. I brought my wife with. The next thing I know, I had my pants off. I was in a robe. I was on a table, and I felt like I was having rubber bands slung into where the sun don't shine. And he did a biopsy on the spot.
Wow.
And I had no preparation. I had no warning that biopsy might carry some risk. I don't even know if they knew that 14 years ago. They must have. But I got back my first report, and it said that I had high-grade pins. Well, back then, people took that seriously as a precursor to Gleason 6, which was very scary, I guess, back then. And so the one good thing the doctor did was he got a second opinion from Jonathan Epstein at Johns Hopkins. But he set me up for the sucker punch, because I came back in 6 months and I got diagnosed with 1 core, 1 millimeter Gleason 6. And so I get the doctor, I call him the notorious Dr. RP. And there's a couple of explanations for that. One is it was his favorite operation, but it was also his initials. So I'm outing him right here in Melbourne. So
he said radical prostatectomy for this 1 millimeter, 1 core. I suppose 14 years ago, active surveillance was only kind of starting. I mean, that wasn't a rare recommendation probably.
I would say that it was average, but I wasn't, I hope, an average patient. And I'll explain why. I mean, because I had been the medical reporter. I knew where the bodies were buried. I knew how to dig out information. So I was prepared for my second visit when the doctor hung crepe and he says, Mr. Wolinsky, you have cancer. He didn't say you have low risk cancer. He said, but good news, bad news. Give me the bad news. You have cancer. what's the good news? Well, I have an opening in my operating room next Tuesday, and I can cure your cancer. And so his teeth probably dropped, and he was a young urologist trained at the University of Chicago. And I said to him, well, what about active surveillance? Well, he got very huffy. He said, I don't support that modality. So I went to the University of Chicago, where I knew they had an active surveillance program because I was the medical writer on the Chicago Sun-Times. And so I knew. And so I went there and I saw Dr. Scott Egner, who I saw for several years after that. And he's, I think it was an act of kindness because he said about Dr. RP, he said, well, yeah, he probably could cure your cancer, but I don't think you need the surgery. You're the poster child for active surveillance. He said, I predict in 10 years, your cancer will not have grown. Well, meanwhile, I encountered another figure in Chicago in the international urology, Bill Catalona. In Catalona, I was interviewing him for an article. Actually, back in 2011, 2012, I wrote an article on what you name a cancer is important. And back then I was interviewing Catalona and Egner and other stars of Chicago urology for a magazine, talking about what about a rose is a rose is a rose, or is it? And so I was talking to them back then about renaming, Gleason 6. It was the subject, back then, maybe it was 2012.
Yeah.
And Catalona said, you're crazy. You should have surgery like tomorrow.
Wow.
And meanwhile, the years passed. And if I had had that surgery, I never would have known the outcome, right? So what happened was I ended up having a total, in the first 5 years, of 5 biopsies. Back then, they were doing them annually, and I was a compliant patient, although feeling like a pincushion, right? and hearing those rubber bands in my dreams snapping. And so I found out, as a result of having those, that the cancer was never seen again. It was seen once in a single core.
There you
My
go.
doctors say it's probably still there, although I did an interview with Dr. Hamdi. A patient group I started were giving an award to the PROTECT trial. Mm-hmm. And I interviewed Dr. Hamdi in London, or in Cambridge, or wherever, Oxford, I think he's at.
Yep.
And he said, have you ever thought that maybe the biopsy removed the only core of cancer you had? And that was my wife's theory too, and mine, but my doctor said no. But so the thing is go ahead.
It's interesting, isn't it, Howard? Because what you said is correct. What you call it matters, because even to a very well-informed person like you, a medical journalist who knows the jargon, who knows what he's listening to and what he's hearing, the word cancer must have left you in a state of shock for just a minute.
Well, okay. I mean, I have become involved in a lot of different ways, and I got to mention to you one with listening in a moment, but I started writing. Facebook was new. I was teaching at Northwestern University in the graduate school of journalism at the time. I think my students were all afraid that I was going to spy on them in Facebook, but I started writing about my experiences as a patient. And suddenly I started hearing from my friends, my pseudo-friends, my almost friends, their husbands, their brothers, their sons, and they wanted to talk to me about active surveillance. And, I'm not a physician. I don't even pretend to be one on the internet. But, I remember I was down in Florida during a very cold winter in Chicago, and I was there for a couple of weeks. And I remember having a conversation with a former colleague from the Chicago Sun-Times. She was looking out for her uncle or something. And so I was given, I can't tell them to do what I do, but I can tell them what I have done and why I have done it. And so as a result of this Facebook business, a friend of mine was founder of MedPage Today, an online a medical news source. And so I was in a medical journalist meeting in Cleveland where she lives, and she invited me to do a blog for them, a patient's journey. And I said, well, what can I tell the doctors? They know everything. I only know what I know. And she said, you'd be surprised. So
Wow.
I started to write this column, and it took off. And the next year, that was 2016. 2017, I was invited to be the first patient to speak to the ASCO Genitourinary Congress. It was down in Florida then.
Yep.
And so we had it all arranged. And this is going to get to the listening thing that you brought up. What was I going to say to these people? I was going to thank them. And so about a half hour into the program, they were supposed to introduce me, but they changed moderators and they forgot me.
Oh, dear.
And so another half hour goes by, and I'm thinking, well, if I don't say something, this will be a lost opportunity. So I said, oh, would you mind if I said something? So I went on a 7-minute rant on what was wrong with the optics of this. You invited me here, you paid my way here, and then you forgot me on the stage.
Gosh.
And so it made an impression on the audience. And not everybody caught my name, but some doctors wrote about it. And then I became sort of an underground hero to men with low-risk prostate cancer. They were talking about me.
Yeah.
And I got an email from a guy named Throne Thorvaldsson from Iceland who started a support group for men on active surveillance. Well, it turns out the active surveillance guys don't fit in that great with the men with more advanced cancer. A lot of these active surveillance guys are very emotionally distressed. They think that what has happened to the guys with more advanced disease with a chamber of horrors of side effects from treatment.
Howard, let me cut in there and ask you a few questions just because I'm conscious of time. There were 3 things I want to pick your brains on. The first is the patterns of care of active surveillance in the US. So you run this great blog or newsletter called the Active Surveillor, and we'll put a link in the show notes, where it's still an important consistent theme in all your writings is that we need to be doing more active surveillance. Can I ask your thoughts on the current state in the US of active surveillance? I mean, it's really improved is my take. Nowhere near probably where it should be, but surely would you agree that the utilization of active surveillance for low-risk disease has improved, even if there's variability?
Oh, it's improved, but it's not where it should be.
Yeah. What is it?
Back when I was diagnosed, when I was diagnosed, it maybe was 6 to 10% of us who had the cojones to go on active surveillance. Cojones is an English word. Then it started to increase in recent years, and about a year or two ago, it reached 60% of the U.S. But you got to say, in the state of Michigan, and I'm a former Michigander, I was at the University of Michigan, it's 90%, which is in low-risk men, which is comparable to Sweden or UK and maybe Australia, for all I know. It's like 90%. So can we do better? Hell yes. Even Dr. Catalona thinks that we can go up to 80% at least.
Yeah.
But, sometimes I'm portrayed as sort of the champion of active surveillance, but really my goal is not that. My goal is to see that men are informed about their choices and that they make the choice that's most comfortable for them. Absolutely. Some guys can't live on active surveillance.
Can I put it to you, Howard, that one of the ways in which we have reduced overtreatment of prostate cancer, which is what I suppose was suggested to you all those years ago, is the widespread use of MRI in countries like Australia and the UK. So if someone comes in with a raised PSA, they're not going straight to a biopsy at all, ever, in a country like this where MRI is widely available and completely funded. They have an MRI scan, and if the MRI is normal, they usually will not have a biopsy. And they're the group of men with normal MRIs that you will find. The precision trial showed us like 25% of those men have low-risk prostate cancer. Do you think that's still an issue in the US, that MR is not widely available to men with a raised PSA? They're going straight to a trust biopsy.
That's one of the things that I bang the drum about.
Yeah.
is the underutilization of MRI. And I'm a guy who hates MRIs because I freak out in the MRI. But I know that here's what I think. We were in a state where we were over-treating and over-diagnosing. I think we're still over-diagnosing. I think we need to cut down on the number of biopsies. I think we need to use biomarkers more and use MRI more. And I'm talking about this from a U.S. perspective. MRI, it seems like a great tool for this, but it's underutilized. I read a major study recently, and I was talking to Dr. Morgan at the University of Michigan about it. And I said, he didn't believe me. But I said only 16% of the men at these major institutions had undergone MRI. Mm-hmm. He didn't believe it, but I sent him the study. I'll send it to you, too.
True.
Absolutely.
And we published this Lancet Commission on Prostate Cancer. I'm not sure, did you see it? We published in April this Global Commission on Prostate Cancer.
I got a front page story out of it.
Yeah. And look, one of the things we pointed out in that is that in first world countries, the overdiagnosis is still an issue, and that MR is really largely one of the biggest ways in which we can address that. And I think in the US, a real first world country, there's this extraordinary variation in access to MR. Some institutions, you've got good access, but it can depend on insurance, it can depend on the institution. So I still think
whereas it's almost uniform in Melbourne and standard
exactly,
practice.
and it's funded. Yeah. So it does mean so we looked at this in our registries, our national PCOR Movember registry recently, and the proportion of men being diagnosed with low risk cancer between 2015 and 2021 dropped from 28% to 15%. So the low risk cancers are coming out of the system because of the use of MRI. Well, we're not finding them, which is a good thing.
Yeah, so I'm on the same page with you. I don't think we need more men on active surveillance. There's a burden.
Don't find them in the first place.
Agreed,
Don't find them in the first place.
Yeah.
And look, the other thing we want to pick your brains on is
something that Howard's been a big proponent of and written a lot about and run campaigns about, isn't it?
Totally right. And this issue of trust and transperineal, Renu, because we've had this on the podcast a lot, of course, with some nice data coming out.
Recently, a randomized controlled trial, and so
two.
That's right.
And you're writing a lot about it on MedPage Today and in the Active Surveillor. Just to give by way of background for the audience, here in Australia, transperineal biopsy is almost ubiquitous. More than 90% of all biopsies in our setting here are done transperineal. But in the vast majority of situations around the world, it's still mostly transrectal, including in the US. But what's your take on that? And your vivid experience at the start of drop your trousers and bang, bang, bang goes the biopsy gun is still shocking to hear.
And in fact, your article was actually entitled "No More Men Need to Die from Transrectal Prostate Biopsies."
That was the background.
Well, they don't need to die. They don't need to die.
They don't. You're absolutely right.
And so where do you think we're at in this? Because there have been randomized trials, and we know what our urologist take on it is. I mean, in Australia, that ship sailed long ago. But what's the sense in the US among patients? Is this something that people are aware of? That there's two ways of doing samples if you need a biopsy?
I sent you folks an article that was just posted yesterday, and it was about my campaigns. I didn't write it. But one of my campaigns is on transperineal. I was a consumer reviewer to the American Urological Association when they put out their new guidelines for early detection. And my advice to them was, you guys are letting the house burn down before you call out the fire department. You got to stop this fire. Guys are dying. They don't need to be dying. But, there's two different attitudes towards transperineal, the European versus the United States. The European is, from my understanding, is heavily focused on the risks of infection. In the U.S., the emphasis has been on safety. And in the U.S., I was told, there's going to be these double-blind studies coming out, and it's going to guide us on this. Well, two of those studies have come out, and really, one of them said the transrectal and transperineal were about the same. And then there's another one that's come out, but all the details are not out yet, that found a statistical significance to transperineal. So we're, you talk about the ship sailing. Well, we're lost out at sea. We're on the Lost Dutchman, and we don't know where we're headed.
Which port you're headed for in 5 years, yeah.
But I did a survey, and I haven't printed it yet. I'm trying to look at the numbers now, but maybe 5% of American men had transperineal 2 years ago. 1 year ago, it was about 10%. Okay. I don't know where it's at now, but I can tell you among the readers of the ActiveSurveillor.com, how's that for a plug? Let me see if I can call this up. I have it on a screen in front of me. It's
yeah.
Yeah, because I bet you if you went back 10 years, while Howard's pulling it up, it would be like 1%. But, I think when I try and explain this to people, it's like, well, why would you stick the needle through the poo when you can stick it through the skin? The prostate's just there.
Just there,
and it's just because it's convenient and it's traditional, roll over there, stick the needle up the poo, loads of antibiotics required to keep that safe. But the prostate's just there. Sorry, Howard.
This is a small sample, but it's recent. And 68% have had only transrectal of the respondents. 13%, well, if you want to be specific, 68.4. 13.2% have had only transperineal. Okay. So, and then 18.4% have had both. So that means, like the newer guys got transperineal, or if they previously had a biopsy, they had transrectal. Now, okay, then I asked them, what sort of biopsy will your next one be? And 10.3% said transrectal, 48.7% said transperineal, and 43.6% said they were not sure. So if I can make a bad pun, the needle is moving. It's moving from the rectum to the transperineal. Well, that's why they pay me the big bucks as a journalist, right?
Well, and even just using your platforms to raise the awareness, because I bet you among your catchment of lovely patients, some would find this a new conversation. They weren't aware there's an emerging other option. So this is an important mission that you're on, that we encourage you to help patients feel better informed.
And it's it's interesting and reassuring to know that the majority of patients now will actually expect a transperineal biopsy.
They're going to bring up the conversation,
which is good.
Howard,
next topic.
The last thing I want to talk to you about. Well, my
glamour
favorite
topic.
A glamour topic. We did a talk about this. I did a talk at the APCCC in Lugano recently about this topic of digital rectal examination in the modern era of fancy imaging.
Does it have a role?
Does it have a role in early detection? Does it have a role for staging men who've been diagnosed, etc.?
And in fact, can it be a deterrent?
Yeah, and is it a deterrent? Is
diagnosing?
Is it stopping people coming in the door? So it's a really interesting topic in general, but it's quite topical for us because we've just been speaking about it and we're writing about it at the moment for the manuscript that comes out of the APCCC for European Urology. But you've been writing about it, and I love the way in the ActiveSurveillor.com you had a lovely pro and con. You had a part 1 and a part 2 recently. We'll put links in the show notes for the DRE yes, DRE no. Now that's a bit simplistic to say it like that. There are nuances, but can you tell us your thoughts from the patient perspective on the role of DRE? We can give you our clinician perspective.
I'll tell you, first of all, it sounds terrible from an American perspective, but there is a racial component to this.
Yep.
I live in a community that's, I just looked it up. It's 2/3 African American and 1/3 whatever I am. And so, before COVID, I would go to the gym and I would hear a lot of these guys talking about stuff. And often they would talk about prostate. And one of them was, I didn't get into it, but I was shocked to hear this one guy say, I'm so glad that I had that operation because that meant I didn't have to have any more digital rectal exams. Can you believe that?
Wow.
Like they had a radical prostatectomy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, and so we had we had a support meeting. I started a group within a group just aimed at active surveillance, and one of the guys spoke up, and he's a Johns Hopkins patient, and he started asking about DREs, and so I wrote a note to his doctor, Dr. Pavlovich, who runs the active surveillance group out of Johns Hopkins, and he wrote response to a bunch of my questions, and so I ran his response. And then I went to the guy I call the Euro heretic, and he took it apart. And and I'm hoping to include something from your presentation in my newsletter. But I just did a survey, and one of the surprising things is how conservative patients really are. So in some cases, more conservative than the doctors. And so I asked, do you undergo routine DRE? And 65% said yes, 35% said no, and amazingly, 0% said, I'm not certain. So I think the survey worked.
Yeah.
Yeah, you don't like to have 50% uncertainty like on the previous question. Well, look, can I give you my take on it, having reviewed it recently for this APCCC presentation, and we will share that link for anyone who's interested. But I looked at different scenarios, and I think the one relevant for this conversation is the early detection. What about us men as we get older, the at-risk population? And there's a really nice article in the British Journal of General Practice from Mike Kirby, Roger Kirby's brother, who's always been a big, long-standing primary care physician with a big interest in prostate health. And, 2,000 odd patient survey from Prostate Cancer UK showing that, I think it was 60% of patients are anxious about the idea of a DRE, a third of whom said it's the reason they're not going to go and see their doctor. And it was especially so, exactly as you said, Howard, in black men, those men most at risk of getting really bad outcome from their prostate cancer. So with that background of DRE is an issue for people out there in the at-risk population, there's thousands of patient survey, we have to critically appraise, is there a role for it? And look, there's been two important articles in the past year. In fact, one of them you had on the European Urology Oncology podcast that Renu runs.
That's right, Peter Albers.
From Peter Albers' group, German study, a prospective randomized trial showing DRE is of no benefit. And the other is a systematic review also in European Urology Oncology in the past 6 months, again, showing the same sort of thing. It doesn't add anything. So when you think it doesn't add anything, and yes, we all have those stories of the guy who we only diagnosed because of the DRE, the one in every, very few people, versus the large number of patients who perhaps are not coming in the door because of the DRE. My take on it is that I think DRE should not have a role in routine asymptomatic men at risk because it does more harm than good.
And in fact, it can do more harm than good because, if the results of a DRE or the findings of a DRE are the basis for a referral to a urologist, you can get a lot of false reassurance from a DRE.
That's true, especially if you're not doing an MRI.
That's right, and that might mean the patients are not referred when they should be. So in both cases, it really has no role.
What do you think, Howard? And we'd love to have a part 3 on your Active Surveillor. I'll put in my penny's worth and I'll share you a link to the APCCC talk. I'm sure Silky and Aurelius won't mind. But yeah, what's your take on it for the at-risk men, asymptomatic men in their 60s?
You're asking about the DRE.
Yep.
I'm biased. I was part of a committee from November that came out with a report that said that we should end it. So I say, it doesn't bother me physically. I've had uncountable numbers in the last 14 years.
Yeah.
Although, to be honest, I haven't had one since before COVID. Because they haven't found a way to do this remotely yet. Although I'm sure somebody's working on it. With haptic technology. But I think, with if MRI were properly used, I don't think that you really need it. Although we would lose a great source of prostate humor if we got rid of it.
I did talk about that.
There's plenty of historic humor.
It is. It's funny in those sketches we all remember. But, even those things might be the thing that puts off the guy in the gym, as you said, to think, I don't want to go and have that done. Or there's a cultural reason why they just find this as something that's unacceptable to them.
Yeah. Well, some of them feel that it's like homosexual act.
Yeah, exactly right. And
I mean, that was the unsaid thing in what we were saying.
In the locker room. And look, we have to respect people's own views on this, but I think it's because when you critically look at the data, and as I say, randomized trial plus a big systematic review in our top journals this year showing that the utility is no. It'd be different if the utility was very high and you'd say, look, we need to get the message out and reassure people, but it's not. So therefore, I'm with you.
I think it's just something that survived because of practice and tradition.
And it's different, of course, for the at-risk man, the guy with the lower urinary tract symptoms, the guy where there's something not quite right. Us urologists will always have it, but of course, what we would do is do an MR instead, like a virtual DRE as we describe it, and so on.
Now, we're almost out of time, but there is one question I do want to ask Howard. Yes, we do. Howard, 14 years on active surveillance. You had one biopsy many, many years ago that showed one core of grade group 1 disease. Many biopsies since that have found no disease. What are you going to do for the future? How long will you keep active surveillance going?
Well, I wrote an article about this. I mean, if you keep banging your head on the wall, when do you stop?
Exactly.
I did an article for MedPage today, and I didn't talk to you two, I should have, but I talked to 16 top urologists, and they were totally divided. I'm 76 now. What should I do? And 4 of them said, just, be on your way and don't even think about it. Some of them said, just get an MRI for the road as you're approaching 80. And although I have to tell you, I don't feel 80, I feel 16, going on 17, okay. So, I call it, the train. And I was talking to Dr. Hamdi, and he said, by all means, do not have another MRI. He said, just monitor it. My doctor uses the PHI test, prostate health index. And I've been stable, for 8 years. Even though I'm steadily aging, my PSA is steadily staying pretty much the same, even though I'm aging. So
you may be able to hop off the train.
Yeah.
You may be able to hop off the train.
He might get off the train.
On the other hand, when I was, let me see, I was, I don't know, 57. I had a STEMI, an MI, and I walked away unscathed because I'd always been an exerciser, and I was in really good shape, and it almost killed me. So, I see the preventive cardiologist once a year. So would it kill me to keep having a PHI test? Because, just because I've been lucky so far, am I going to be Mr. Lucky in the years ahead? Or, is the barn door closed on treatment anyway, so screw it. So I wrote about it, and, I did a survey of these 16 doctors, and most of them said, you probably have less than a 1% chance of being at risk. And I surveyed patients. I got a couple hundred patients view, and again, they were far more conservative than the doctors. I was kind of surprised. I feel like I could walk away from it. I do feel like I've changed my tune in saying, let's not have so many surgeries or radiation therapies. But now my tune is, let's not have so many biopsies, because the biopsy is the choke point.
That's right.
Yeah.
Especially transrectal.
Well said, Howard.
Fantastic, Howard. Well, look, keep up the great work. That's all I'll say to you. I suppose a lot of crap lands in all of our inboxes all the time. But since the Active Surveillor started dropping in my inbox a couple of years ago, I've really enjoyed it. I love your writing style, by the way. But you also pick up on some great stories, and it's not just about the topics we talked about today. You do cover a really broad gambit. So we'll put links in, and please, do sign up to Howard's wonderful thoughts on the Active Surveillor and on MedPage today. Your articles there are always very, very insightful as well. We'll put a link in.
It goes to show having being a talented writer and having personal experience is a powerful combination.
A storyteller.
Absolutely.
Actually,
we know
before we
this
finish,
Tim Baker.
Exactly.
Yes, yeah.
So you might enjoy Tim Baker, is another great patient of ours who's been on the podcast, a writer like yourself, a surf
journalist.
Yeah, so he's got a real style, surfing style, and he was diagnosed with metastatic prostate cancer when he was 49, 7 or 8 years ago, and he's written a great book about it. But maybe we'll put a link into his book and to the two
ironically
podcasts
called
he's done.
Patting the Shark.
Patting the Shark.
Fantastic.
And it's a great story.
It's a good read,
so
Howard.
we love to have another friend of the podcast who's a talented writer who shares his story and is making a difference to patients around the world. Howard, goodbye from us in Melbourne, and thank you very much for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me. It was fun, and I hope I can come back.
Oh, we'll certainly have
Absolutely.
him back. And that's all we've got time from this episode of GU Cast. And we did enjoy that chat.
It was fun.
Active Surveillor, we'll put the links in there, or just Google Active Surveillor. That's Surveyor, as in for OR at the end. And it's a really good read. So please do tune in to Howard and all his thoughts. And we wish him all the best in keeping up his great campaigns to change the way prostate cancer gets done for very many patients, especially in the US. Take care.